most people think of the EBITDA and the revenue, and they're like, that's the real value. And no, businesses are people, their expertise, their playbooks, their learned experiences, right? And I think in Mini Katana's case, the real value there is the learned playbooks and people. It's never going to be a massive business, but it is a very effective one at its job. For a long time, you had people saying data is the new oil, data. It's inevitable at this point, I think, that there'll be some breakup. But on the other hand, like, how long does that take? There's all these side pressures. You have China. They have cut out the e-com sellers. They know how to do content. They're clever. They're hardworking. Of course, they're going to figure it out. Amazon is testing an integration now, TikTok shop. I think that's the first potential sign. And if there's more positive signs, then I may have to dip my toes back to the world of TikTok.
Because you think there's a good chance Amazon is going to go and buy TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only potential buyer.
Hey, it's Andrew here, and welcome to the eCommerce Fuel podcast, the show dedicated to helping 7- and 8-figure founders build incredible businesses and amazing lives. And today on the show, joined by Isaac Medeiros, who is the owner of Kanpai Foods, which is a freeze-dried food company that you can find in a lot of different places. And while that is his latest venture, he started it, 8 months ago, and they're almost to 8 figures within 8 months, which is wild. He's probably best known in the e-commerce space for minikatana.com, where he blew up this, a katana is like a small sword or even a big sword. I'm not sure the difference between swords and katanas. We didn't get into that, but I think I have a hunch that people get really annoyed when you call katana swords. So we'll call them katanas. But he's best known for launching that brand. And so today I wanted to have him come back on and talk about, Kanpai Foods, why he's going to a new business. We talk about some of the struggles he's experienced in building that brand, in some of the content he's produced and some of the L's they've taken there, why he thinks from a business perspective, EBITDA isn't the most important thing. He's got a pretty interesting prediction on who he thinks is going to buy TikTok, and just a lot of other stuff. Isaac is a really smart, thoughtful, great guy. So hope you enjoy this one. I do need to disclose I am a very small investor in Kanpai Foods. And so at the end, when I'm pretty much, just telling you to go buy copious amounts of freeze-dried candy for yourself and your children, I feel like I would be a little disingenuous. I mean, I'm saying that mostly to help Isaac, but maybe there's a small part that's just trying to, wildly enrich myself. I'm not sure. But gotta disclose it. Anyway, hope you enjoy this one. I sure did, and we'll get into it right after this. Oh, dude, what is that piece of hardware back there? That looks familiar.
It's the 10 million YouTube sub thing.
Can you go grab that so I can see it up closer?
Yeah. Dude, it's so heavy. It's so heavy.
That's amazing.
It's very fingerprinted right now, but it says
it's got like a big stone in the middle of it.
Yeah, like a glass thing. It's pretty cool.
Do you just kind of cuddle up at night with it? You put next to your pillow and kind of like caress it and kind of spoon it as you go to sleep?
The first night.
So 10 is that 10 million lifetime views or 10 million what's the 10 million metric?
That's 10 million subscribers.
10 million subscribers.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And that was for Mini Katana, right?
Yeah. That one is for Mini Katana, and then the Spanish Mini Katana, and then I have a bunch of the silver ones for like a bunch of stuff.
Dude, that's super cool. Congrats, man. Very few people hit that. Very few people hit the million mark, let alone the 10 million mark. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's cool that YouTube does that too, because not every platform really cares that much, right?
Do you feel like, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but you got really, it seems like the rocket fuel for Mini Katana originally was TikTok, but more recently, it seems like you've been much more of a fan of YouTube from the way they're sharing revenues and ad dollars, and also potentially from the way they just interact with their creators. So are you feeling like YouTube is really the future for content versus TikTok online?
Well, it was never not the future. I mean, TikTok never got to the point where creators can make a real substantial living off of it. And that's the key differentiator. When you look, creators are really small media businesses when you really look at them, and their impact on the wider economy. And businesses need to make money to expand, to reinvest, to do all sorts of things. And TikTok doesn't really offer a good avenue for that. I mean, now there's a TikTok shop thing, but that feels like you're not really selling, you're not really building an audience as much as just selling stuff. Like you're a QVC host, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I thought we talked about like 2 or 3 days ago before this podcast, but I thought your prediction for what might happen to TikTok was really interesting and well thought through. I don't want to steal the thunder for it. I'll let you do that. But if you're willing to share, I think it's a fascinating one.
Yeah. And I'm keeping an eye out for more signs. I know Amazon is testing an integration now with TikTok Shop. I'm sure you've heard about this. And I think that's the first potential sign. And if there's more positive signs, then I may have to dip my toes back to the world of TikTok.
Yeah, well, because you think there's a good chance Amazon is going to go and buy TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only potential buyer. Like, I don't see anybody else where it makes sense, right?
Yeah, we did a podcast, I don't know, a couple of years ago. I can't even remember. Maybe more than that even. And I feel like you were most well known, at least historically, have been most well known for Mini Katana, the sword business that you built up. Would strongly encourage everyone to go listen to that. It's a great podcast. Talks about Isaac's story, his roots coming over from Brazil. Really, really cool story. So a lot of people some people know you, for your new venture, Kanpai Foods. But I think a lot of people still associate you most strongly with Mini Katana, which is still a business that you have and still run. But can you give people, maybe before we start talking and get in the weeds on the new venture, what made you decide to jump and do something new?
So really, we have to go back in time and retell the story, but retell it with a few extra years added on this time, right? So there's the first part of it where I started a little letter opener business. It's called Mini Katana. This was in 2021, early January. Some people may know that we got banned off of Facebook because there are weapons that we were selling, letter openers. So, but it was working. So we had like a decent enough product to know that this was like, there was something here, right? And because it was working, I kind of went all in, maxed out my credit cards, actually called my best friend, asked him like, hey, can I borrow some money from you? So like,
dude, risky move.
Yeah, it was not a lot. It was like $8,000, $5,000, but it was a lot to me.
Yeah.
Right? And Facebook banned us at that after we got all that inventory. So I was like, what do we do here?
So you call your best friend and ask him if you could pay him back in Mini Katana letter openers, if that was a valid currency to repay the debt.
He was very he didn't know about any of this actually. I was going to solve the problem before he found out. And that process involved trying every single advertising channel I could think of. And I tried Pinterest ads, Snapchat ads, kind of worked, but couldn't scale that. And what ended up working was, and this was I wasn't even like really posting on TikTok intentionally. I was using it as a way to get good video creatives for ads, really. But the first video got a few hundred views. And the second video actually sold a unit. A unit, somebody looked up the website and just bought something. And I was like, wait a second. Like something's there. And the third video sold out our entire stock. So I took that and ran with that and built for the first year it was all me, just doing all the work. We did about 2.5 million that first year. And it was just really me building a relationship with the customer through videos and comments. And what that ended up happening was everyone asked for big stuff, big swords, real swords. We figured out how to make big swords. We have a minority stake in a forge in China. And then that became the Mini Katana that people know today, right? But what the key moment was year 2, when I looked at the landscape and I said, TikTok is really cool and we have a business here, but also YouTube is where all the real creators build substantial enterprise value. That's kind of the end game. So year 2, we became obsessed with YouTube. We launched in about May, April. And our first year, we did like 8 million subscribers, something crazy. And that's the Mini Katana that I think people know today, where it's like the really viral YouTube channel, 1 billion views a month, just pulling insane numbers and insane reach. But what was interesting is year two, this phenomenon ended up happening where we got so much attention so fast. The brand went to, 10 million, and then it just stopped increasing in size. Like we could not get above a certain threshold of sales every month. And we tried everything we could think of, right? And we tried exploring other product categories. But people really wanted the swords. They liked the content for the swords. And our views kept increasing all this time. So it became this increasingly frustrating issue of, hey, we're getting more attention than ever. We're becoming more efficient marketers than ever. But it's not paying off for the business. It's not driving the business outcome. And what I had realized was this business has a massive total addressable market issue. The marketing playbook is probably one of the best potentially, seen in recent years. However, it's not, the business itself is too niche for that marketing playbook to really see its full effect. So year three hits, right? The business is stalled. And I kind of start wondering, hey, what am I going to do here? What's next? And this is when I actively start looking for other new categories. I talk to a lot of smart people like you, Andrew, people like Sean Frank, people like Rowan Kahn, a lot of people in the ECF community. And I learned, I need something big, YTEM, that has compatibility with my marketing playbook. And I kind of narrowed it down to a few categories, but freeze-dried candy really stuck out as a potentially massive one, right? And it was three things that really stood out to me. The first one was that it's a new category of confectionery. So you don't know how big it can get, but we know that candy is huge. So there's a potential for a new player in there to really dominate, is what I'm saying. The second thing is it just tasted really dang good. I actually ordered like a ton of different brands, went to farmers markets, and I was like, wow, like I could see myself being passionate about this product, right? The third thing was that it's bright, colorful, and it ties very well with our content strategies, right? And the audience who's watching them, which is on the younger side, teenagers. So that's kind of how we arrived at freeze-dried candy. I know it's a long story, but I think the context matters.
No, it matters a lot. I mean, you maxed out the size of your market and found another bigger pond to be able to play in. So what do? You decide you want to build a freeze-dried candy company. You know nothing about freeze-dried candy. How did you get funding for it? What were the first steps you took? You manufacture all this stuff as well. Like right now, jumping ahead a little bit, you've got a full industrial kitchen that you're cranking this stuff out at. You've been doing it 8 months. And I have to say, the speed at which you have iterated and got this up to speed, I mean, some people have taken longer to file an LLC than it's taken for you to, in 8 months build, multi-7-figure revenue business. Every time I read your updates, I'm just blown away. So yeah, what were some of the big puzzles or hard parts you had to figure out early on in this game?
So I think it's useful to talk about the history of the freeze-dried candy niche. And I want to be completely honest here. I'm not the first guy to do this, right? I am not the first one. And that's an important lesson for folks out there listening. Don't be the first, right? Settlers prosper. What was it say? Pilgrims die, settlers prosper, right?
Yes. Yes, that sounds about right.
But I noticed it when I started Mini Katana. Like the freeze-dried candy thing was a thing on TikTok that whole time. So that's how I knew about it. When I first saw it, I thought it was a fad. So really what I was looking for was a reassurance that it wasn't, right? And I did really 3 things to decide that. I bought a freeze dryer. This was January of last year, my first freeze dryer, a small one, put it in my downstairs living room, and I started experimenting myself. The second thing is I was looking for signs that it was doing repeat volume on a channel somewhere. And last year, something miraculous happened. We saw that it had launched on shelves, like weird stores at first. And I remember going to these stores and asking them, hey, how's this doing?
I love that.
You can actually just go into the stores and ask store managers, guys, how stuff is doing.
It shocks me how much information random employees will give you about stuff. I've done this before too. Like if I'm walking down Main Street and I go by a watch company and I'm like, okay, you're downtown Bozeman Main Street you're probably paying $10,000 to $15,000 in rent. I'll go in and ask them like, hey, how many people come in? How much does your average watch? And I'll try to like build a very rough P&L in my brain. And I've done this a lot. It's amazing how much information. So they gave you all the goods, it sounds like.
Yeah. I had, I had like World Market store people, all like, I think I was like a Circle K or something. The store manager was telling me everything. And you just have to be nice.
Yeah.
It's only prerequisite. But I learned there was a lot of repeat going on. And no one knew about it yet. And that's when I decided, hey, I got to go all in on this. So really, I spent all of last year trying to understand the process, how scaling would look like. And we actually invested in our first commercial kitchen space in October last year, because you can't, it's food. You can't really sell it without a commercial kitchen. And there are some steps in the decision-making process. Like people always ask, why did you go with a third-party manufacturer? And I think there's some really distinct advantages of manufacturing, and I can talk about that later. But the most important thing is quality control. We sampled third-party manufacturers, and I'm a product guy. Everything I do comes from the quality of the product. But the second thing was manufacturing is moat if it's a new category. If no one else knows how to make it well and you're scaling that, why would you give that away to a co-man, right? But I bought the freezer in October, and we launched on TikTok Shop, right? Sounds familiar here, repeating history. And we scaled it up to a few thousand first week or so, and it was working, right? And then I ended up shutting that down. And what happened was I just saw, like I did that trick again, right? I asked around, I talked to people, and I saw the GMV on TikTok Shop was very unimpressive.
Sorry, I missed that part. I said, you saw the what was unimpressive?
GMV, the general merchandise volume.
Yeah.
Like there's just not enough volume being done for it to be a real business. And I knew I would hit like a low 6-figure wall right there. And I was like, I'm not here to do something low TAM again. Let's go to like the biggest possible market where can I sell. And that's when I started becoming obsessed with retail, right? Which I had been hearing a lot about in the ECF community from members. And we got our first PO in December into box lunch. It was a very tiny PO, $4,000. And then something magical started happening, because once you break in and if it's a great product, people see it. Other buyers see it, right? You're in the real physical world. And all of a sudden, like World Market's like, hey, what you got there? We want to try that.
Calls you and they're like, hey, are you the guy that was interrogating our sales associates about volumes? We'd like to buy some stuff from you.
It went a little bit different, but that's the high volume. It was reassurance that it was working somewhere else, and now it could work in their store. And we scaled through that process from our tiny commercial kitchen space into a 12,000 square foot one. And now we have like 4,000 retailers. And I think, Andrew, when does this episode come out?
Sometime probably in September.
Okay. If this launches middle of September, we actually landed Target 2 months ago too. So by the end of this podcast, we'll be in like 6,000, 7,000 doors. And really what's leading that is like, don't overthink it. It is a product. It's that great. Our challenge is like, we just need people to taste it and they understand.
So from the retail side, was it just as simple as like, how did you make the connections? I know you have a co-founder that has a lot of retail experience. Any tips for people, assuming they have a great product, for getting it in front of the right buyers? Or is it just a matter of calling them up, being relentless, getting samples on their desk, and just kind of waiting?
I think relentless follow-up is the first tip. But I will say a pivotal moment for us was going to a trade show. But I think zooming out, before I start giving tips on retail, like the lesson in here is not, hey, they're good at retail sales. The lesson is, hey, they picked the right category with a great product. Mm-hmm. Because like, that's why this looks so easy. It's really not. We spent a year working on the product itself. Right. So I think before we start giving tips and tricks on the retail sales, it's like having that great product is a prerequisite to get these results.
Well, you either hired or have someone on your team, like an official food scientist. Talk a little bit about the product development. I mean, it's interesting because you're taking candy, and I don't know if you make it from scratch or if you buy existing bulk candy and then freeze dry it, but talk a little bit about what went into all the R&D to make the end product.
So the freeze dried category started as an accident, really, right? With survivalists buying, they were freeze drying stuff, prepping, and they started freeze drying candy, existing candy like Skittles, and to discover that, hey, this really changes the flavor texture completely. It's amazing. So that's how we started. Our first product lines were existing name brand candies. Um, I will say we brought on a food scientist and we started working on proprietary kind of formulations, which most of those are rolled out by now. But I think what's so genius about this category in particular is that it kind of hijacks famous flavor profiles, and all it does is it turns them into a new texture. It's kind of hard to mess that up.
Your milk duds have to be my favorite. Like the milk duds freeze dried milk duds are unbelievable. You were kind enough to send over a sample kit, which didn't last very long. And the kids I had to like ration out to the kids. Otherwise they would have given themselves diabetes in about 3 hours by just consuming all of it. But really, I also wonder too, when we got those, like you mentioned Skittles, do you have to worry about any kind of legal issues with taking Skittles and changing them and reselling them?
Not anymore because we're using our own formulation. But I've heard mixed answers about this, because if you buy a car, let's say you buy a Prius and you put a Toyota engine in it and you sell it as an end product, did you just rip off a Toyota? Like it's a different finished product. I think the only contention is that there's a trademarked S on it. But we're past that at this point.
Yeah. It's just something that I was curious about when I saw your stuff. Going back a little bit, we in our conversation earlier this week, one thing that stood out to me that I thought was really notable was how important it was for someone to believe in you, and just validate the idea. And I thought that was for you in this process. And I think it was this one versus Mini Katana as well, but especially this one. You had kind of a pretty interesting conversation with Sean Frank. But talk a little bit about that, if you would, because I think that's something that sounds very woo-woo-y, right? Like, oh, you just want someone to believe in you, but it is a real thing. Like I told you, I thought back to when I started my business, and my, at the time, girlfriend, now wife, Annie, believing that I could do it very matter-of-factly was a huge motivator for me when I wasn't sure if it was going to work. Anyway, if you talk a little bit, if you would, about how that worked for you this time through and Sean's role in that, because I thought that was super cool.
Yeah, and I'll say Sean doesn't deserve all the credit on this. I think I had a lot of ECF support, and I also have a longtime partner who I've been with for 7 years. But, the story I told you is I met Sean at the first ECF event, and he almost immediately told me, hey, what are you doing selling swords? Like, this is a stupid thing, because you're going to run into, like, you have a better playbook than that. You're going to run into issues. And I mean, he even went as far as to like make a whole kind of deck, like just telling me ideas of things I should go into that are not swords. And candy was actually one of them at the time. But really, like, before I went to that first ECF conference, I didn't even realize how big consumer brands could get. Like, I had my first win as an entrepreneur. And I thought that was like, wow, this is it. Like, it's game over. I don't come from a background where like you're just surrounded by entrepreneurs who can kind of show you that there's a lot more. And that was the eye opener, right? When Sean has a 9-figure brand, there are other 8-figure, 9-figure founders there too. And they're all talking about this like it's casual, right? Which makes you think it's possible. And that's like kind of like a magic moment in your brain. But yeah, like I think the quote I said to you was, sometimes having somebody believe in you is like the last ingredient you need, right? That's what's holding you back. Because some people don't come from that background where they have that support system. And I'm definitely one of those people.
Yeah. How do you, when you think about scaling up what you've done with this candy brand, what's been the hardest part along the way? And it hasn't been that long. It's been 8 months. You developed it. You got all of the products set up. Took about a year to do that, and then you launched it. What has been surprisingly difficult about scaling the brand this year?
The hardest part of it I would say since we're manufacturing it, we're learning a lot for the first time. And in particular, we're learning how capital intensive it can be to manufacture your own stuff and also to do retail at the same time. And I think, I had never really kind of considered it this bad because I had always had terms with factories and I always worked out, people talk a lot now about borrowing from your factory, basically, right? We can't really do that at the same level. So that's been the hardest part of this, just the capital intensive nature of it. And I would say the second hardest part is if you get a large retail account, they can bear hug you. I don't think people realize how much volume a large retailer will do. And it feels like a bear hug when you first encounter, you're like, how do I deal with this? And we're actually in the middle of that with Target, right? Where it's like, this order is their forecast is so much larger than we had anticipated that right now it's all hands on deck, working 70 hours a week, the entire team, just to try to make the deadlines.
So are you thinking about already expanding kitchen size and getting a second kitchen or just getting a much larger kitchen then for manufacturing?
That's definitely, I'm already looking into it. We're looking at the Midwest and other regions. I'm in LA with the manufacturing because we started here and I had to move quickly. And there's a cost to moving quickly, right? Mm-hmm. Which is you trade some efficiency. But I'm already working on that. And yeah, I think people, when you go into retail, you have to have two things ready. You have to be prepared to deal with the net terms. You're going to tie up a lot of your money. And if the product does very well, then you have a situation where they could triple the forecast, which is a great champagne problem, but it's also a business problem. It's a real one.
So how are you financing? I mean, you've got financing on two sides. You've got financing the kitchen side of the business, the cost of goods, which I'm guessing is relatively small. But then you've got to finance and float the terms for the orders you're fulfilling for Target on retail, which I don't know if they have net 30, net 60, net 90. You got a lot of financing sides of this. How are you, is it line of credit? Do you have investors that are how are you financing all this?
Well, so this was a conversation earlier about people believing in you. Sean was one of the first 3 checks into the business as an angel. We've had a lot of support from just past relationships that we've built while executing Mini Katana. And I think people kind of understood, if you're really experienced and you've been in business for, I'd say, over a decade, and you see somebody have their first win, you understand what went wrong or what went right with it pretty much by just talking to them for 30 minutes. So I had a lot of those, right? Where it's clearly Isaac has learned a lot. So I had just a massive support there. And then the second thing we've been using is a lot of PO factoring, which just, shortens your terms. It's actually been it was challenging at first because the business is so new. And I'll say, I've spoken to some VCs on the CPG side, and it's we had 2 issues where it's first of all, people doubt the category because they're this is a fad. And usually that's solved by just sending them a sample box. It's okay, well, just try it. And a second element of that is the VC landscape has dried out completely because there's been just so many bad outcomes. So we've had to really rely on angels and friends and family and PO factoring to really make this work. And also my personal, I'm all in on this basically.
Yeah. On the candy side, I was just thinking about this. Retail, your packages of candy sell for what, $7 a piece?
And Target will be $5. We have new batches for Target.
Okay. $5's a little bit easier. Super interesting, great product. But even for candy, I think, even candy, kind of an impulse purchase kind of thing. Usually you go in $6, $7, $5 is on the high side for candy, even on the low side for your product selection. Has that been a challenge at all, trying to be on the upper end of a small kind of impulse purchase for these stores?
No, it's worked in our favor. And I think that's more of a macro thing. the consumer is obviously hurting. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this podcast are having a hard year. On the sword business side, we're having a hard year. And I think consumers really like cheap luxuries. So our candy feels premium. The packaging, the way it's displayed, feels incredibly premium, and it's priced like a premium product, but it's still really cheap, under $10. So it's at that point where you have to think a microsecond about it, but anyone can afford that, and I think that's working really well in our favor because it's like, oh, I want to try this cheap new luxury.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So, Isaac, what about the? Well, you mentioned Mini Katana is having a tough year. People so often on the podcast we talk about people who are just drinking champagne and just buying boats and just living like everything's good, no problems. And I think people really appreciate, myself included, kind of more of the real talk when it's been a struggling and a tough year, which it has been. So on Mini Katana, what are some of the challenges you're seeing this year?
We timed out, which means there's no more growth for the business, which means the business is like, it's not at the same revenue level as last year because there's so much consumer weakness. I think if we could still acquire a ton of new customers, it was just like, it would have been easier. But yeah, I mean, it's been a rough year. I think we're in that spot where it's high AOV and people don't actually need it. So it's like the worst spot to be in.
It's like the opposite of the candy business.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, it's actually so interesting how much of a parallel I have between the two enterprises. But here's why, like, I don't know if I am that upset about it, because the main asset that Mini Katana has is the YouTube channel at this point. And I actually became kind of so laser focused on increasing audience last year, which is why it's so ridiculously big. And I picked that over revenue almost. And now we get to see that pay off in the form of, hey, we can just market the candy on Mini Katana's channel. Right? And we've gotten like 500 million views for the candy this year on Mini Katana's channel, which is like, there's this magical moment where it's like, I recognize that from somewhere. I don't know where. Like, I saw that before. And it makes the consumer that much more likely to buy it on shelves and try it.
It's the subconscious planting it in their brain. That so when they're rolling through the Target aisle, they see it and it catches their attention in a way it wouldn't. How are you? What kind of content? Like, you're really creative. Swords lends itself. Even people without a lot of creativity could probably come up with some ideas for how to market swords, right? Like, they're dangerous, ninjas, fighting, interesting. Candy is a much harder one. How do you build a content-based business around candy? So how are you doing that? Because that's really the root of your marketing strategy. Is you're an amazing marketer with short form video and longer form video in some cases. But how are you thinking about working candy into that? That's more of a challenge.
So I'm going to be very transparent about this. We talked about how people don't talk about their L's.
Yeah.
I think our content this year has been a massive L. And I know we have results, like we still have the 200,000 subscribers on YouTube, but we should really be at 1 million by now. And let me walk you through what kind of happened. Our thesis was, let's just show the candy being made and make skits around that. And it was a mediocre success. And what that looks like to me is like 50 million views a month is the average we're getting at, and we're capped. So we're actually in the middle of a giant content pivot right now, where I've gone out and built a studio in Spain, of all places, this time. I know the sword business has one in Alabama. This one has one in Spain. It's just people never,
Why Spain?
What always happens is I always find one amazing individual who's so good. I'm like, I'm going to build a team around you and recruit other people so they can learn from you. That's why these studios keep being in weird places, because like when you're looking globally, I don't discriminate. But we're going to be pivoting to what I call mass entertainment. So I'm sure some people are familiar with Duolingo's strategy of the mascot. Because you're right, like the candy is a lot harder, and that has been a learning for us this year. So we're going to be doing more just crazy stuff with a mascot. Have you ever read Shoe Dog?
Yes, I have. The Nike story?
Yeah. So I've become obsessed with Nike, right? this year. And I'm like, my entire thought process is like, I don't really care what we do as long as it's very cheap CPMs and people see the panda. Those are my two goals. And it's the parallel there is Nike invented sports marketing, right? And they got dirt cheap CPMs at the time, free basically. And they got millions of people every night to see that swoosh logo on an athlete's foot. That's what I'm trying to accomplish for Kanpai. So the way I'm thinking about it is our mascot is going to be famous. And because of that, people recognize the candy on shelves.
So is the content strategy all around the mascot then? Like stories, engagement, he's going to be the Tony the Tiger of the, of your candy brand, so to speak.
It will be. And I think like, here's the challenge with the content thing. Every brand is so unique. Like you need to come up with your own thing. In our case, like mascots resonate really well with the target audience, which is younger. Mm-hmm. And it just happens to be easier to make videos around. But like, with the sword brand, the mascot would have never made sense. So every brand, I've realized every single one of these brands that I am involved with, there's a real learning process to the content strategy that will create exceptional results, not mediocre ones.
Interesting. Is your plan long-term with this brand? Is there any direct-to-consumer play here? Like, are you going to have a Shopify store that you can buy the stuff? Do you think that will drive meaningful sales of stuff? Is that going to be kind of a nice bonus, or is the lion's share of the plan that 95% of this plus is going to come from retail and you're going to just do the marketing online and that's how it's going to get delivered?
Yeah. Again, it's like a lesson in category. In our category, candy, it's all physical basically. Like, yes, I'm sure there will be a DTC component, but it's like 1% of our addressable volume, right? So it's really like, again, the category lends itself super well to impulse retail.
What about scaling up a team for something like this? How many people do you have at Kanpai Foods?
Almost 50 actually. 50.
Okay. So you build a team of 50 people in, 8 months of operational activity. Maybe you had some people in place beforehand. That sounds horrifically difficult to me to try to hire 50 people in 8 months.
Keep in mind we're manufacturing.
Yeah.
So, a lot of those people will be just a freeze-dry cook or a candy chef, as we call them. Mm-hmm. And we run 24/7. So that gives you an idea of how that's like, that most of those hires are all just production.
Well, what's the breakdown to production hires versus non-production team members? How many do you have?
So 40 of those 50 are production.
Okay.
And then we have like 2 sales. We just got an account manager because we have like 50 accounts and it's getting a little bit much. And then there's the creator hires and designers. And on that, I've cheated a little bit because we're just borrowing from Mini Katana when we need it, which is like, that's been a really unique, what I discovered is like, the first brand I built was so difficult to build that we have such a cool talent pool to just get stuff from whenever we need. We have the crazy good designers. People ask me, hey, how did you design your bags? It's the Mini Katana designers. We have great content creators who can give us expertise. And I think that's been a real unfair advantage for me, this whole process.
Yeah, I've noticed a real commonality, not always, but often among repeat founders, that they're really good at the parlay, right? They build something up. And in your case, you were able to parlay Mini Katana, which is a success in its own right. You use that to develop your chops for media, for content, and we're able to, and e-commerce to some extent, and then, to full extent, and then able to roll that into something that had a bigger addressable market. But I've seen people do that. It seems like it's always impressive the way people are able to piggyback off their previous venture into something new, especially if they can retain ownership of it. So,
yeah, I think what I've realized is like, there's ways to think about businesses, right? Most people think of the EBITDA and the revenue, and they're like, that's the real value. And no, businesses are people, their expertise, their playbooks, their learned experiences, right? And I think in Mini Katana's case, the real value there is the learned playbooks and people. It's never going to be a massive business, but it is a very effective one at its job.
Mm-hmm. It's something too that it can create profitability for you and fund the investment in what you're doing now to some degree too, which is a huge, huge advantage.
Yeah, I mean it's like YouTubers, right? The audience creation process, you need to do that for free, basically, for years before you start having enough goodwill to make
Mhm.
profit later. And I think that's kind of what a lot of the media game is about. You can't just start selling a product. And the thing about our content strategy, though, it's like I think without any content, Kanpai would still get to 50 million plus. That's what I've realized. But the content is there to get us beyond that. That's really what it's, it's a very unfair advantage that has a huge impact when we're at scale. Because the packaging is compelling enough to drive the initial kind of curiosity.
One of my favorite new things recently has been when I get something from a new brand, especially a new ECF brand for whose members I know a little bit about. Uh, I love really enjoying the unboxing, the seeing how things are presented, how they're wrapping things up, the branding elements of it. It's become one of my new favorite pastimes. Try to document it, take pictures, and share it sometimes if it's applicable. Anyway, what is that? You've done such a good job with the packaging for Kanpai. What have you really tried to stress with that experience? Because it's very like the candy is an experience in of itself, but yeah, you've boxed it up so nicely too, and in an interesting way that adds a lot of value to the experience.
I think what we try to do is, Kanpai comes from the Japanese influence. And again, the panda comes from the Asian influence, but we really wanted to mascot to be the main thing. Because I've realized in my years of media that people don't follow brands, they really follow people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like a mascot is the closest way a brand will have to that. So that was the first thing we really designed. That's why every single bag, I wish I had some in this room, but every single bag has a unique kind of emotion from the mascot that it's trying to convey. Other than that, the second priority was let's make this appeal to kids. So it was colorful and fun and bright. And I think candy just lends itself to being like a category where you can do kind of ridiculous things. Think of Willy Wonka when you first watched it.
That's a great point. Yeah. Well, it was fun watching my kids dig into this stuff. When you were doing the R&D for the products, maybe more on the test side or the tasting side than in the packaging side, maybe both. Did you get kids in there? Like, did you take your stuff? You're like, okay, we think this is good. And like, granted, any candy you give to a kid they're going to attack with gusto. So maybe that's a hard way to gauge it. But did you bring kids and teenagers into the process when you were doing the R&D?
Yeah, we asked hundreds of people. And also, my co-founder has a daughter who's very young, so there's an unfair advantage there. But very early on, we actually had an earlier iteration of the packaging for TikTok Shop that was just didn't have the mascot and didn't have the fun. But I think the mascot is really what 5x the packaging.
Interesting. On the content side of things, I mean, you've been doing this. When did you start Mini Katana? What was it, 2019?
2021.
20. Oh my goodness, that's great. So 2021.
January.
So you started Mini Katana 3 years ago, that's insane. It's been that short of a time. How are you changing how you make content from, even a year ago when you look at YouTube, which is where your focus is? Are you doing things differently? Are you changing formats? Are you changing your strategy for rolling out content? What has changed, especially on the platform or the way people have consumed content in the last year that has caused you to adjust your strategy?
So I think this year, we're really doing the biggest thing we're actually doing different is a bigger emphasis on Instagram. And that's a bet on TikTok getting banned, just to be clear with everyone out there. I'm not saying it will, I have, frankly, I hope it doesn't. We have 2 million followers there. But if it does, yeah, 70% of the audience is migrating over to Instagram. Reels is actually great now. It used to be garbage, but it's actually fabulous in my opinion now. And Instagram, again, is part of Meta, and Meta is very good at copy and now executing. They've done that historically. So we've been really emphasizing Instagram. It's paying off. We're probably gonna have 1 million followers by the end of the year there. But on the actual content front, I think this year we're going more into personalities, whereas before it was always about the swords and the brand. We're trying to we don't see a path to 100 million subscribers without relying on personalities of our
Mm-hmm.
creators. So this year we've been focused on building a cast and kind of executing against that, and it's paid off in a meaningful way. And I think because we're more focused on personality now, it lets us advertise Kanpai or other brands when we feel like it.
And when you say personality, do you mean the mascot, or do you mean actual people that are reps behind the brand?
People too. Our creators are known within the brand's community now, whereas last year they may have been, severely less known, and that's a conscious effort. And I think, like, again, people follow people, so you
Yeah.
can get to a certain size by just being a brand, but you're limiting yourself really. Um, at a certain point, we become a fancy talent management agency. We're not there yet, but maybe in a few years.
Interesting. For people listening to the podcast, I know I've kind of been on this bandwagon for last year, but I used to think, and I think it was true, that 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, having your personality or a personality tied up with your brand was more of a liability, especially if you wanted to sell the business. But I think now, given attention so much harder to get, it's actually an asset if you position it right. I think it's a very powerful thing. But that's if you're a brand owner, right? Like if you're the owner of the brand and or have a large stake in it. For what you're doing, you're bringing in a lot of creators. I'm guessing they don't have equity. And maybe it comes down to just diversifying enough where you don't have just one person or two people that represent it all in case they leave. A lot of that goodwill goes with you. But how do you think about trying to tie up association and goodwill with people who may not be with the company in 5 years or even 3 years?
I mean, you look at don't be a jerk. Like, don't be your employees. I don't know how else to say it. Like, why do people leave? Right?
Yeah.
There's a reason. The people don't leave in a vacuum. That we're very, very intentional about how we deal with our people. And I'll also say, I think that the risk is like lower than people think. When they think of brand risk, they think of a YouTube channel with one creator, not a cast. Multicast YouTube channels are a little bit of a safer bet. But yeah, there's a reason why people leave. Like, look at Donut Media; all their creators left recently, and it's because they're all treated incredibly bad. Or BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed had a network of channels, lost their creators. Why? They didn't have creative freedom, or they weren't treated like people. Think of it like you're managing a sports team, and you're dealing with their emotions, their wants, their dreams, their desires. Work with them.
The problem with sports teams is, man, athletes are notoriously bad for hopping all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe that's a bad comparison, but I see it that way internally.
Yeah.
Like, you're just a coach.
Well, you 3 years into this, Mini Katana was the first go through. This is the second run. And granted, you may have 50 employees, 40 of those may be in the kitchen, literally. But you still have 10 people on the Kanpai side that you're leading. What have you learned and that you're doing differently this time around versus from Mini Katana on the people or the management or the leadership or the hiring front?
It's interesting you ask that, because I actually wrote this down yesterday in my journal. I think up until this year, I was really bad at hiring. And, like, I didn't really know how to, I didn't know when to hire. There's a lot of, challenges, like when to hire, who to hire, and how to hire, right?
Yeah.
Those are all very difficult skill sets. They're specific skill sets. Knowing when to hire, the way we're approaching that is we wait until we're overwhelmed in a subject matter. So, I mean, that sounds simple, but I didn't do that with the first brand. I just kind of hired willy-nilly. So it's like an account manager. We brought that in when everyone was overwhelmed dealing with comms with every account. So there's a clear need. Who to hire, I think we've gotten better at the interview process. And I think the key differentiator there is we know the right questions to ask now. And we've learned that culture is far more important than skill set. Mm-hmm. So the interviews are more based around them instead of, hey, what have you done? It's more like, what do you like to do? Do you know how to start a campfire? Silly questions like that, but it tells you a lot about their personalities.
Do you know how to start a campfire? Is that really one of your questions?
I ask that in every interview.
Really? Is it just to gauge how resourceful or outdoorsy they are, or
nobody knows how to start a campfire? So I don't. So you're just
I don't believe that. You're telling me if you were in the woods and you had a book of matches and no food, a piece of raw meat, the only way you're eating is, you could get a campfire. So what do you mean? I'm surprised that you say that. You've built a YouTube channel to 10 million people and you tell me you can't start a campfire? I don't believe you.
Maybe I can, or maybe I'll figure it out, but nobody knows how to do it. So you get some interesting responses. And I think that's what I'm trying to find out. Like, how quick are you on your feet?
Yeah.
Are you going to lie to me? Or are you going to say, I don't know? Or are you going to do something in between? The idea is in between, where you're like, I don't know, but here's how I imagine I'll do it.
Interesting.
And I think when you have team members who can think on their feet like that, it's perfect for a startup.
Yeah. What are some of the other questions that you ask in that same vein of kind of, campfire-esque interestingness?
I'll usually ask, like, if they're a horoscope person, kind of gauge, like, I think I just like gauging I don't know why I asked that. I just like throwing them off. I asked them how much they have looked into the brand, and then, like, I'll follow up with what's your favorite video and why. That's one I always go to. And then I usually, like, start digging into why they applied for the job. And if somebody didn't do it intentionally, like, that's my biggest red flag. The ideal candidate is somebody who really wants to work with us and is quick on their feet. Because we know, like, if we're hiring you for an account manager today, in 6 months you might become a sales manager because we're growing so quickly.
What's been the most interesting response on the horoscope question? Curious what people's reactions are to that.
We had one candidate go, "This is pagan," and I was like, okay. He was very religious, and I respect that. So, but we've had some mixed reactions. I think on the campfire one, the most interesting one was somebody suggested, like, I'm just going to break into my car and get all the gasoline and pour it, and there you go. Campfire.
Siphon out the gasoline, get the fire rocking. It's the easiest way to do it. Well, last question for you here, Isaac, 'cause I know we're kind of getting a little short on time, but Roman Khan at ECF Live gave a great talk about how, he thought it was really valuable to build enterprise value alongside taking money and, building personal wealth as well. You can do both at the same time if you're careful. And I know earlier in Mini Katana, you kind of had the question of how much should I reinvest versus how much should I pull out, in case things, just from a personal safety net and kind of future net worth kind of perspective. I'm curious your thoughts about that, like what you ended up deciding on Mini Katana, if you're taking a different or the same approach with Kanpai, and kind of any thoughts you have on that issue. Because I think it's a big one. I think it's a lot of times like you're swinging for the fences on this, which I think is super cool and respect in terms of, building Kanpai into being something really big. But I'm curious how you think about that, having one business that's done well, having another one that's growing quickly, and just any musings on that topic.
I'll be transparent. I haven't taken a salary from Kanpai this year at all. Right. And I take a small salary from Mini Katana, but I think there's other vectors into that calculation that I put in. I'm really young. I'm 27. So, and my goal in life is to build a lot of experience, network, and have a good base, right? I don't think your life starts until your 30s, in my opinion. So I can afford to, invest a significant amount of my net worth into Kanpai, which I have done. I think if you're a little older, then you're in a different place in life. You obviously should make different decisions. But that's where I'm at. In terms of what I ended up doing, I did give myself a bigger salary out of Mini Katana. But then Kanpai took off, and obviously, I think it's a really important skill set to be able to recognize when to go all in. Like, I think that's key. Like, there's certain decisive factors or moments in your life, and everyone gets them, where if you don't go all in, you miss out on the opportunity altogether. And it takes a certain level of wisdom to even see those opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
But if we weren't executing Kanpai this fast, others would be. The demand is there. The cat's out of the bag. So I have the wisdom and acquired experience to recognize, hey, I need to do this no matter what right now. So I think that's where I'm at. I don't know if that's kind of a convoluted answer, but
no, I mean, that totally makes sense. And you're right. It does depend. I mean, like with Kanpai, one of the things we're trying to do is it's a brand new category. It's a bit of a land grab for market share, and you're trying to get out there and invest as much as possible. And sometimes it makes sense to take some money off the table. Sometimes it makes sense to put absolutely everything into getting as far ahead as possible for building a future presence, brand visibility in the space. So no, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And I will say, like, it's not like I'm taking high risks here. Like, retail is very safe. Once you have a shelf, you have it forever, basically, as long as you perform. And we have repeat purchases supporting us. And I think that was all a factor. I will say, like, don't go all in if it's high risk, obviously. What I've noticed, though, is, like, e-com has gotten so ridiculously hard.
Yeah.
I would not go all in on any e-com business at this point in time. Unless it gets, like, unless something significant happens, some new marketing channel or something. But it's just gotten impossibly harder. And it feels like it's going to get harder next year again.
Yeah, I agree. It definitely has gotten harder. You've got to hope that at some point, I mean, you can't have, maybe you can, it's a world I don't want to live in, but I imagine you can't have all these businesses just struggling and having every last cent from a demand perspective and a customer acquisition perspective squeezed out of them by 2 or 3 companies. I mean, you look at Google and the monopoly ruling that came out recently. I think that's an encouraging sign. But it seems like at some point, something's got to break where people can't, because you got to have an ecosystem that I'm convinced that people are continuing to buy things, and they're going to continue to buy things online. But you can't have an ecosystem that only benefits and siphons off almost all of the surplus to the big tech giants. It's just not sustainable. And so I feel like at some point, I don't know how, I'm not smart enough to see how that all breaks down, but you've got to have something that comes up that allows for people to get in front of an audience more cost effectively, and that can hopefully, be a challenge for some of these bigger juggernauts. So I don't know if you are optimistic about that or not, but that's what I hope.
I mean, it's funny. For a long time, you had people saying data is the new oil. Data. And that led to these giant advertising networks, right? Data. Mm-hmm. And it's like, what happened to Standard Oil?
Got broken up.
Like if you're going to if you're going to compare oil, data being the new oil, like you're forgetting the other part of the story, right? So I think there is a case to be made up that it's inevitable at this point. I think that there'll be some breakup. With Google, it's obvious that it's probably going to be Android that's broken out at the very minimum. And we have a very, very aggressive government that's actually doing antitrust action now. But on the other hand, like, how long does that take, right? And there's all these side pressures independent of the government. You have China. They have cut out the e-com sellers. They're savvy now. They know how to do content. There's viral Chinese TikTokers speaking fluent English. I've encountered people saying, hey, they can't execute on brand well, and I think that's so naive.
Yeah, agreed.
They're clever. They're hardworking. They're gonna of course they're gonna figure it out. So I think like there's all these side pressures outside of money being funneled to monopolies that make it difficult. And unless those relent, I don't see a growing market or an easy market for new entrepreneurs.
In August, released a fantastic episode with Bernie Thompson, who we talked about China and how he competes with China and the e-commerce forces and competitive pressures there. And if you haven't listened to that, I'd strongly recommend it. One of the things I think as China gets more sophisticated, I've talked to numerous sellers who aren't just facing pressure from Chinese sellers in commodity products, but from brands that, like you said, are very sophisticated and Western looking, and you would not know they weren't made by somebody in Seattle or San Diego. And I think one of the things, like in your space, you're super well positioned because people aren't going to probably knowingly buy candy from a Chinese seller if it comes from China. They're just not going to do it. And so something like that, I think you're in a really good spot. But yeah, I think that the universe of niches and products that's going to be feasible to compete with is definitely getting smaller.
I think that the lesson there is, as an entrepreneur, you got to have a vision for the outcome your business has, right? Is it a retain and hold? Are you looking to sell eventually? And you have to decide that early on. Because, like, take Amazon sellers who are getting their arbitrage is dying, right? They're getting beat up. It's like, well, maybe that I don't want to sound harsh, but maybe that wouldn't have happened if you knew what you were going to do in the early. Because I've seen a lot of people just coasting on the same product lines. If you were going to retain the business, you should have been developing unique IP, unique assets. So take some of that money and act like you're going to retain it. But yeah, I think that's the lesson there, because like I can be forthright about this with Kanpai. I'm looking to sell it. That's my hope within 10 years.
Yeah. Help Isaac reach that goal. KanpaiFoods.com. Probably not the best place to get it, although I think you can. So I love this stuff. I've alluded to it earlier. I've got 3 kids. They absolutely decimated this stuff as much as I would feed it to them. They would come in and beg me like, Dad, can we have the candy today? Can we do chores for the candy? They loved it. Amazingly. And it's interesting. Like some of the flavors, Isaac, aren't, I'm sure just like anything, people have preferences. Some I think are good and some I think are just phenomenally good. So you've got like freeze-dried gummy worms. You have the freeze-dried milk duds, which I thought were one of my favorites. You've got some like Mexican style spicy candy, which is really good. Skittles. It's a great backpacking food. I went on a backpacking trip with, last couple of months and took a bunch of it, and it was phenomenal for taking on the trail. So, and then also in terms of retail outlets, you mentioned you can get it at Target, you can get it at a World Market. Where are some of the other places people can pick it up? We
have random accounts like JCPenney, Box Lunch, Hot Topic. You can find it at any mall in the US, basically. We'll have a lot bigger accounts next year. We're kind of running up to the wall of what we can support with Target.
Yeah.
I think one of the takeaways from this episode is I wasn't destined to like have a great business on my first one. Like if I kept that going, it would have become a bad outcome. And that's okay, because this is a journey and I love it. And as an entrepreneur, you should also love it.
Well, we didn't touch on this episode. We talked about it last time, but Mini Katana was not your first business. It was like your 6th or 7th business. And I think
it was my first success.
First success. But I mean, your willingness to work hard, your willingness to like be able to pivot and try new things and stick with stuff. I think it's super inspiring, man. Like, I think it's really cool what you've built and the hustle and the perseverance you've had. I think it's pretty rare. And I think everything you've, been able to build with a great team is well-deserved. So awesome job, man.
Yeah. An awesome job to the ECF community for, being like 20% of the reason why I started Kanpai. So.
Well, thanks, man. It's been awesome having you in the forums. You spoke at multiple of our events and at eCommerce Camp. So very much looking forward to watching you ride, build this up into something massive, hopefully sell for a huge exit. And I'm going to be sampling all your stuff along the way. So let's keep it up, man.
Amazing. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you.